Yesher koach, everyone. Shabbat shalom. So there's a story told about a young yeshiva student who purchases a container of milk, and the milk that he purchased, I hate using this term, but in Hebrew it's called Chalav Yisrael. They call it kosher milk. In all transparency and honesty, there's no such thing as non-kosher milk should it come from a kosher animal, but for a host of reasons we're not going to go into today, there's a category classification of milk. If you go to a kosher supermarket, they have something called Chalav Yisrael, which literally means Jewish milk, meaning it was supervised. But nonetheless, the regular milk you buy in the supermarket is certainly fine. No reasons for concern. Anyways, this young boy goes out and he buys the milk and whatnot, and he puts a little label on it. It says, writes his name, and he says, please do not use without permission. For anybody who's lived in a communal setting, a dormitory or whatnot, you know the experience of writing your name on things and asking people to ask for permission before they take it. When I was a student learning, I used to write my name in all of my books, and a very, very clear kind of warning not to use the book without permission, because often they're not returned. Anyway, so he writes his name on the milk carton. He comes back later in the day, he wants to make himself something to drink, and the milk carton is empty. And he goes, I don't understand this. He goes, this is a yeshiva. It's a place where people are studying religious texts. They should be mindful about not stealing things. So the next day he goes out, and he buys a carton of milk, and he writes on it, this milk is not kosher. He comes back later in the day to make himself something to drink. The milk carton is as full as when he left it. So then he goes to the head of yeshiva, and he presents to him the conundrum. He goes, when I wrote down that under the penalty of theft that they shouldn't touch it, everyone drank it. When I wrote down that it wasn't kosher, no one touched it. He goes, I don't understand. Which one is more important, stealing or keeping kosher? And the head of yeshiva turns to him and says, let me explain. Everything in life is an order of priorities, which is both a joke and also a reflection. Life is always a set of priorities. We each have our own. Sometimes we share them. Many times there's an act of discord between differing ideas of priorities. Truthfully, it's one of the great reasons why in life, both in our personal relationships and our communal relationships, that we have difficulties with other people. It's not that, well, sometimes they don't. It's not that people don't hear what we're saying. It's just that they hear more of what they're saying. With that in mind, I want to make a quick left turn, so to speak, because this Torah portion that we read this morning, although it's not the last of the Torah portions, there's one left, but we actually don't read it until Simchat Torah, that Parshat Ha'azinu effectively for us on a communal level is the conclusion of the book of Deuteronomy, which means that it's the conclusion of the 5 books of the Torah. And then the next time that we read the Torah publicly on a non-holiday Shabbat, it will be starting again from the very beginning. And so it seems to me to take a brief look at what the book of Deuteronomy is, what Sefer Dvarim is. We're talking about priorities. In the biblical context, there are 3 great priorities. The priorities are, first and foremost, the establishment of this humanitarian, this humanistic monotheism. The second is the establishment of the religion of the people of Israel, particularly the sacrificial worship that was unfolded every day in the life of ancient Israel. And the third one being the establishment of a kingdom of Israel and a king. The story, the legacy of the kings of Israel, Saul, Solomon, David, Tzidkiyahu, Hezekiah. I can go on and on. If you read the latter books of the Torah, you know well, of course, the long, tortured, difficult story of the kingships in the people of Israel. What's interesting is what we read this morning is absent any idea, for the record, any suggestion of worship in the temple. And there is no mention at all of any kind of kingship. In other words, the entire Torah portion is talking about the future and the establishment of perpetuity of the Jewish people. And yet there is no discussion, no mention about protecting and ensuring the survivability of the temple worship. There is no discussion or mention about the necessity of having a royal authority over the people. And in fact, what I would say to you is, if you would look over the book of Deuteronomy, you will in fact see this over and over again in large comparison to the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers, where you see an incredible preoccupation and attention to the most minutiae of details regarding sacrificial worship and the construction of the temple and the establishment of a king and the laws pertaining to a king. In the book of Deuteronomy, we find not those laws, but in fact the opposite by and large. We find laws that tell us and speak about the limiting of the power of a king. Remember and bear in mind that unlike any other ancient culture, and for that record also in modern royal societies, just for example, the king or queen of England is the titular head of the Church of England. They're the head of the church. In ancient Israel, according to the book of Deuteronomy, the king had no role in the temple. Who was in charge? Who was the final authority in the temple? The Kohen Gadol, the high priest. There is no sacrificial role for the king in any way, shape, or form. But there are restrictions on the king. There's a restriction as to how many wives they will have, how many horses they will have, how much they're allowed to tax. There's a restriction on the king that he has to walk around with a miniature copy of a section of the Torah hanging from his neck all the time. And what's in that miniature section of the Torah? It is all the laws that contain and put checks and balances on the role of the king. For the high priests and the priests themselves, what is the other checks and balances? Famously so, the Torah records that when the Kohen finishes their sacrificial worship for the day, and they're about to punch their clock and leave the office, are they allowed to go back home in their uniforms? No. The priest is not allowed to wear their uniforms, their robes, outside of the precincts of the temple. They must take them off and put their street clothes on. And why, the ancient rabbi said? Because they shouldn't walk out on the streets hoarding and lording over people. Oh, there's the... By a bit of a similar argument, I don't know if these laws are still in the books. There might be a lawyer here who can clarify me. But I know that growing up as a kid in New York, that police officers were not allowed to wear the uniforms when they finished work. They had to change out of their uniforms, and when they were off duty, they were not allowed to be in uniform. It's a similar idea. But the one thing that you see as a central concern of the book of Deuteronomy over and over again is what will protect the future of the people of Israel. And the echo of it is once again repeated this morning, and it is not the strength and perpetuity of the Jewish people will not be found in the establishment of a strong temple with a concentrated power of the priests and a fierce devotion to the sacrificial worship, that the future and perpetuity of the Jewish people will not be shaped or ensured by having a powerful king or queen who has an autocratic grip on the life of the people, that there will be unquestioned allegiance to the royal authority, but the future and the perpetuity of the Jewish people would be found in the moral strength of the individual Jew themselves. That the collective goodness and morality of the Jewish people would be the deciding factor if we would survive or perish, if we would be fruitful or if we would shrivel. And it is a stunning reflection, which is actually a rejection of all the things that came before it. Moses, in his final breaths, because that in fact is what the book of Deuteronomy is. It is his last great soliloquy. It is his last breathing words to his people. This morning, he takes his last breaths and he tells the people once again, if you think the temple is going to save you, you're wrong. And if you think a king is going to save you, you're wrong. The future of a society, Moses argues over and over again, is the strength of the people who make the society, not the institutions, but the people. In this argument about priorities, it ultimately is the individual that will save and determine the future of the people. This idea becomes even clearer about 1,500 years later. You've all heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And some of the work in retrieving, restoring, translating, transcribing the writings of this unusual sect that lived in Qumran, that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, in one of the texts emerges this idea. Remember, what did they do? They picked up and left Jerusalem. They left the temple. They left the priests. They left the seat of where the king was, and they went into a desert where no one was going to find them. You've been there. Masada, En Gedi, Qumran. No one's going there unless you absolutely have to. And they cut themselves off from everything. And in one of their texts, they says that the future of what God wants for us is Mikdash Adam. It is the sanctuary of Adam, of the person. That is where God is to be found. And it is very true still to this very day. And that is the future of what we are as a country, as a city, and as a people, as the Jewish people, is not found in our institutions. It's found in the quality of people. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. Please rise, page 354.